So I think he needs to explain that.
ABS.
Non-Canadian audiences, yeah.
There it is, ABS.
You're training yourself, sorry. Somehow, I don't know. Internship in Montreal. Part of this. Thank you. You have 2 hours? I'm sorry, I should have checked. Good job, sorry. Good job. Oh, yes, so originally, you have to do things that no one else does, right? So you can be a hockey player, you can get to go kind of thing, right? That was very interesting. I'm sorry. I threw out in the water. You did a great job. You did. Of course.
Thank you. I forgot my placard at the hotel.
Mine is it's okay.
Oh, no. Me too.
So who are these folks talking about 21st century board?
That's really a man mistake because but he said, no, you can't have just 3 men in the session, which is right. So, originally, it was going to be you and Vladimir.
Yeah, exactly.
So I'm in the transporter program.
I thought I'd throw the titles, my non-stop
My presentation today.
Nice to be in the chair's position. You can advertise for it. But there are quite a few people that are here.
Yeah, but it's interesting. It's a nice diversity of people, countries, disciplines.
Yes.
It's a real cross-border conference.
Yeah, that's true.
That's a good one. So how's Franco Canyon doing? Is he doing okay?
Oh, really good. It's awesome.
So you drive home tomorrow morning?
No, keep that stuff okay. I'll just make sure they don't need me here for anything they're driving. I may even catch you guys up because you're going to cross into West Bank just by near my house. So it's a good going for 2 hours stuff and better than the way, so I'll probably just catch up around there. No. Friday night's been hard. Saturday night.
I think no.
Where's the Ramada? Is it West Jerusalem?
Yeah, it's West Jerusalem, yeah.
Well, yeah, it must be because you said it was close to the train station.
So sometimes it's, you know, I'm
going to finish up my overview by saying that's what we've been doing for the last 8 months, that's where we are today. And as for the future, that's it.
I will present shortly the project, the 21st century project, and we'll take on it with.
So what are the questions you're asking for tomorrow?
So you're in Germany?
Yeah, I'm at the Franco-German border, working in Germany, but living in France.
Oh, okay.
I just went on Sunday.
Oh, excellent.
Many years ago, I was in summer.
Oh, yeah.
Deutsche Akademische stuff.
Wow.
That
So
was
you know what it is.
35 years ago.
I tried to fix my presentation.
Yeah, the guy was here a minute ago who put ours on. He's got some system, so
Okay, I should wait then.
Yeah, the nuns are great cooks.
I should.
let's hope he comes back.
You're Catholic.
Maybe it's obvious, but he was transferring mine to a particular folder of some kind, and I wasn't sure what he did. You don't know, do you, David?
What's that?
Which folder he's transferring
No.
information to?
Just try it.
Yeah, the port he used was this one over here, the same port that
Okay, for the.
that's the port he used for me. Oh, you have a very long stick.
Of course you will.
Stan Bruin drove me a bit crazy this morning.
So what happened?
First of all, do you remember, he was driving us all a bit crazy. He was going to get from Tel Aviv to,
Yeah.
I mean, every day is an end. And then about 4 or 5 weeks ago, he said, what's name, been ill, and I don't think I'm going to come this and the other, and I'll do it by, I said, Stan, I have to first look into it, because in principle, we decided that the keynote sessions weren't allowed to do that.
Right.
Anyway, that was going back and forth, eventually did. And then in the last 36 hours, he suddenly created a document. He says, and I need someone to show the slides. I said, but no one else is doing that. He says, I've got no idea how to use Zoom. I said, well,
Seriously?
yeah. He says, I know. He says, and I said, I just haven't got time for this. I'm sorry. I sent him the link, and he came on, he came off, and he says, I don't know how to do it. And in the end, he was on for about 10 minutes while the others were lecturing, then he disappeared, and he couldn't get back in again.
It's hard to imagine an academic after 2.5 years of pandemic doesn't know even the basics of Zoom.
So you're taking the train?
Yeah, probably the concept of sharing a screen or something maybe.
Okay.
But still, but why would he have dropped off? I mean, that's the curious thing. He's
I
usually,
don't know. And Keith kept saying to him, click to relink. He said it doesn't work.
It's horrible. What did you play in Canada?
No, I don't.
Actually, listen to that video, just as practical photography. And when it comes up again, it's quite interesting.
Tend to be.
The laws aren't the same as Europe, so you can find that
well, I'm glad you're more informally dressed because I was half worried. I hadn't brought a jacket.
I have got a jacket here.
Well, but you were, you sent out the message before and said it's informal. So I won't bring a
It's
jacket.
the final session. I've got my jacket in my geopolitics stuff. I ordered it the opening.
And you know,
Then when I saw you in the opening session, I thought, oh, I should have brought a jacket.
And I just wanted, I only that for 2 reasons, because Elaine always tells me, she says, until you lose that extra weight, you've got to wear a jacket. Number one. And number two, because I had that time.
Well, I'll tell you this, a conference like this is not good for losing weight.
the food is excellent. It's really excellent.
I know, it's too good.
Yeah, it's very good. Very good. This is the 1009. The traditional food tells and all about that. I almost left with your purse and then I discovered you were staying here, so I just looked at you. Thank you. You're welcome.
Oh, thank you. It is, almost, it looks like it, it's hard to tell if it sticks out or if it's glasses. That's okay. Is it like this?
Yeah.
Just call me whenever you.
No, we're going to do it
say.
We've got a plenary session for 1.5 hours,
Okay,
and then we've got a half an hour wrap up. So,
in the last part. Okay, perfect.
Oh, you did? Well, earlier, yeah.
Much
you go to that moment, find out to take us. Find out the stuff that different places.
I mean, I c'est pas ça.
Non, c'est un peu de lumière, je sais pas.
C'est le souci.
Yeah.
Non,
Exactly.
spécialement.
It's not that- no.
She get it loaded?
Like, I need to think.
Non, je sais pas, mais en tout cas, j'ai jamais dormi plus ça.
Can't see, hold on, I can't see it.
Alec Murphy, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Because you're old.
No, that's not, I said H.
But yeah,
Say,
but
oh.
that was.
Yes, the voice is the one of Fabrizio. Can I ask you to move
Fabrizio, your voice is coming from the heaven.
Yes, sorry, but I will ask, yes, to move the presentation okay, that in order to control that also for people online, the presentation is moving and everything is okay. Because in others,
Alec, can you move the podium right near the table? Because he has a problem getting both the table and the podium in the same picture. So if we move it right over here, it's on wheels, I think. And that way, you should have done that right from the beginning. Yeah, right to the table.
Is that enough?
Move right.
Wait. There are a bunch of tables.
Oh, okay, sorry.
no, okay. If the desk stay there, it's possible to watch.
Move the desk a bit.
Okay.
Fabrizio, can you see it moving?
Yeah. And also moving the slides. Okay. Voice and watching is good.
But it's interesting because, yeah, okay. Well, we need a chair for Ella.
Oh, okay, yeah.
There's so many notes everywhere.
Maybe somebody needs to make an announcement.
Yeah.
Well, just 4:30, exactly. 35 minutes late, my age, so it's giving me that.
Die vader szedł to wasz.
Well, no, I think at least 20, because the session is an hour and a half. So I was thinking somewhere around 20.
It's a very pretty place. Very pretty.
It's gonna be difficult for me to tell you that I have a meeting in Sedona.
Just asking.
No, it's not. Some guys are doing this at meetings in the
One other
great
person that you work with to go, and then, yeah, then it's
No, I
meeting,
just want
right?
to see the place. I can, maybe like around.
Just give the talk from the phone. So look at that connection on my phone and have it excellent over you. 2 hours.
And weather's gonna be perfect.
Dear conference attendees, you are welcome to approach the for the closing session.
Like my sign it from
Violators will be fined. I'm in
We never actually met.
We're only down the road from each other. Victoria.
Well, Victoria, Eugene, yeah, we're at the same time.
The other side of the world.
We're in the same time zone, 10 hours apart from here.
How are you doing?
Just fine, how are you?
It's pretty tough, huh?
Yeah, I've had a little bit more trouble with jet lag this time than usual. 10 hours is a lot. I keep waking up.
You're aware of this because he never comes to see us, right?
He's come on occasion, he's stayed at my house.
If I can't do anything in June, so.
Okay,
No.
that would be cool. I have a thing in June too. With the Fontaine. The Fontaine people, they
What about, what dates?
it's actually the first week of July, Thursday, Friday. Yeah, it's very
I
cool.
had a grand tour of the United States.
I don't want to.
Yeah, I know you have.
Anyway, I do focus.
But then I think that was it.
We bring in 4 or 5 years ago. We went through the West Coast, went to Mazzola, took a car 6 weeks, drove all the way through the southern states, Alabama, Mississippi, and we did sort of all the civil rights sites and everything.
Oh, it's just.
The biggest disappointments in our retreat actually was New Orleans. We didn't have a clue. But one of the most interesting things we did was, well, what's the name of the little place where Kill a Mockingbird was really bad.
Oh, yeah, you mentioned this the other day, right? That's the one. This is the courthouse. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
We were the only people there. And I really got this feeling of the
Did they use that in the filming of the movie?
Is that going well?
I'm not sure, I can't remember. Maybe they did, you know.
Yeah. We don't have her here. She was just talking to her.
Yep.
She's a chair. We were just talking.
I saw the Syrian Bride. It's great. Really good. I recommend watching it. I didn't know anything about the Druze before I watched it. The Syrian Druze. It was good. Well done. Yeah.
Oh, that's popular.
Yeah.
Well, people just, see everybody's,
Maybe you should.
That's a hint for all of you. Yeah, I like that when I travel. Oh, that
I'm
coffee.
sorry, I know you do well.
I was just talking to her 10 minutes ago. She knows she's a chair.
Shall we go right away? No, but I need to know, like, do I need to go to the bathroom before
Oh, you're like really like right away.
yeah,
Run out the door.
like, I mean, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, good. You should sing. Matthew, sing something.
What's going on here with your tag? You've been on your jeans?
We can discuss that. What are you trying to do?
I'm trying.
No, it's fine. Yeah, I think it is.
Were you scared somebody's gonna want you? Good.
We have a chair.
You don't have to sing, but you still have to.
The final session has now started, but we would like the chairperson of the session to arrive.
Call them out by name.
I don't know.
So you went out just as you came in. So you went out that door. You came in this You were missing.
Yes.
You're the chair.
we're looking for you, that's all right. So. Take them on. That's okay. Okay.
Are you sure you guys want to sit together? Remember? No, I'm ready. Oh, yeah.
So, here are the yeah, okay. I stay here, so I look more authority and so we can start. And sorry for being a little bit late. And this is the last plenary, and I'm very, very happy to be here. And I'm very thankful to David for inviting me here and to
suggest me to come to this conference because I've been away from border studies for a while. So I've been very, very happy to be around in this day and listening to so many interesting sessions. This last one is going to have a deep meaning for me. And I hope for many of you, because it's about the role of political geography in border studies. And I really appreciated this organization because it's so interdisciplinary. But I really think that we should learn how to speak together because sometimes you use the same terms, but without different meanings. And so we think that we're speaking about the same thing, but it's not true. And sometimes we don't understand each other. So I think that this is a way of trying to connect it is very, very important. So, well, I just profit from the fact that I'm here to thank David for a English style, not so bad conference. And, so I give the floor to Professor Alexander Murphy, that is one of the most relevant research I've been working and developing ideas and reasoning about the region. And today we will show us the importance of territorial imaginaries. So,
thank you very much, Elena. When David contacted me, oh gosh, a couple of years ago, I think, to be on the scientific advisory committee for this conference, I immediately said yes, because David and I have known each other since, I think, the early Holocene. And, whenever he's invited me to come do something in Israel, and he and his colleague, Oren are kind of longtime friends of mine, it's always been a stimulating experience. And I just appreciate the opportunity to come back and be a part of this event. Elena is also someone I've known for a long, long time, so I'm very much among friends here. One of the things I've really appreciated about this conference has been the broad way in which borders are thought about and talked about, and of course there are borders of various kinds in various ways. And it is then perhaps a little odd, you might think, that I'm going to go back and talk about borders in a fairly conventional way, but I hope in a way that will actually encourage some thinking about how we approach borders more generally. Because as you can see from my title, my focus here is about the border disputes that end up happening between countries. And of course, these remain very relevant in the world today, among the major sources of tension that we can think about in the world today. And it is one of the interesting things that has happened over the last sort of 20 years is not just an analysis of border conflicts that are raging, but ones that have actually become more settled, ones that have become more peaceful. And so there's a big literature on this by a number of people, some of whom I think could actually benefit from coming to a conference like this, but don't necessarily come to a conference like this, trying to understand what kinds of circumstances give rise to a more peaceful approach to interstate border conflicts that actually can lead to the settlement of these conflicts. And if you look at a lot of that literature that's come out over the last 20 years or so, a lot of attention is on what I'm calling either tangible factors or institutional factors in trying to understand these things. So tangible factors like, the presence of resources, population distribution, strategic locations. Institutional factors like types of governmental systems or types of legal systems, the role of international organizations. And these things are all, of course, relevant, but even the literature that tends to emphasize these things kind of concludes that there's a lot of sort of mixed interpretations to, well, is it really democratic or more authoritarian systems? In other words, it's been hard to draw much consensus around all of this. And I think one of the reasons that it's been hard to draw much consensus is that there is perhaps less attention given to underlying psychological and emotional dimensions that aren't quite captured when the focus is simply tangible and institutional factors. Now, in this literature, there's usually a recognition, some nod toward those factors. So in a really interesting, broad overview of this literature that just came out a year or two ago by Powell and Wiegand, you can see some reference to the symbolic value of territory and national sensibilities being important. But but it's hard not to just not to agree with another recent commentary by Mionis and Tudor that said research illuminating the comparative modalities of nationalism and its underlying dynamics has really been historically sparse. And this is not a statement made 20, 30 years ago. This is a statement made within the last couple of years. So you see, the approach I want to take today is to suggest that when we're trying to think about these factors that can lead to the peaceful settlement of disputes, we need to put together a couple of things that I've kind of really been wrestling with throughout my career. One is the larger, what I call normative context in which nationalism, territorial conflict is embedded. This is something that I really was starting to think about in the early 1990s, when there was late 1980s, really, when there were a series of studies being generated talking about, well, where do border conflicts take place? Well, where there are rich resources, where there are large numbers of people. And it struck me always that, well, yeah, you can see some correlations there, but it's not as if you can look around the border of Ecuador and find the place with the richest oil field, and that's the territory in conflict. In fact, the ability to make an assertion that's deemed legitimate, both domestically and internationally, or so I argued in a piece I wrote in the Annals of the AAG in about 1990, was the relevance of a kind of historical argument that is mostly the one that has to be made to make it seem like a legitimate claim. You know, it was once ours, it was wrongfully taken away, we have the right to get it back. And the overwhelming majority of the cases, this is the way it's framed, not just where the resources are, not just where the population is. So it seems to me that's one, that larger normative context needs to be part of the picture, but also it needs to be part of the picture. And this is where I come much more to where I want to go today, is the different forms of nationalism that actually play into the picture. By different forms of nationalism, I'm really thinking about the relationship between nationalism and territory. And this is a session on political geography. I kind of came of age as a political geographer at a time when the subdiscipline trying to look richly and thoughtfully at territory was not just focused on, population distributions and river systems and so forth, but actually was bringing in the behavioral and the emotional and the psychological kind of into the picture. So it seems to me that one of the issues that might actually help us understand better what's territorial disputes might or might not be more amenable to settlement would be to take a little bit more seriously how nationalism plays out in different contexts in relationship to the territorial arguments that are being made. And to get at this, I'm going back to something else I played around with a couple of decades ago, was this concept, which I still think is quite useful, which I call regimes of territorial legitimation. And in developing this idea, I was unquestionably inspired by Placencia Duara's regimes of national legitimation. Talking about a border crossing scholar, is a guy who grew up in India, who has spent most of his life in US institutions and who works on China. But he developed this idea of how over time there's a kind of set of institutions and practices that tend to normalize a certain notion of us-ness, of nationhood. And I thought, yeah, that's right, but there's also a set of ideas and practices that normalize a notion of territorial space, what's rightfully ours. And that was kind of what I was going off of, kind of being inspired by like a book like Zhang Chai-Wing-Chakhal's book on Siam map that was the example. And then so sticking my neck out here, I could say, if you look at some of the norms that developed along with the modern state system, these are ideas, not realities. But there's an idea that, that somehow the land surface of the earth should be divided up into discrete territory units. They should be one or another or another. There's an idea that somehow states should reflect the pattern of nations in the original sense of the term. And of course, I understand that Iceland is the only approximate case, right? That we live in a world of multinational states, not nation states. But the power of that idea it's hard to argue, is still not sort of there in all sorts of ways. And the idea that states should be free from outside interference within their territories. Now, if those are right ways in which often territory is imagined within the modern state system, it's not too much of a stretch to say states are in different positions to invoke one or another of these RTLs, in terms of making a kind of claim about territory. So, say in some cases, it can be an explicitly kind of ethnocultural claim. You know, this is the homeland of the X people. And, you know, done at the extreme edge, this is the kind of, you know, ethnocracy kind of concept that somebody like Oren Yiftachel has written so eloquently about. Or the state's a distinctive physical environmental unit, you know, whether it's, I mean, Australia, but it can be the way, if you look at the early iconography of Italian nationalism, you know, areas south of the Alps, and, you know, and so forth, or that the state is the modern incarnation of some kind of long-standing political territorial entity, to paraphrase Gertrude Stein, Egypt is Egypt. So, of course, what about Angola? To use just one case. There's not really any kind of historical ethnocultural argument that can be raised there. There's no physical environmental argument that can be raised there. There's no historical, let's say what you're left with is actually just the only way a territorial legitimation regime can be posited is basically in terms of a territory that has been bequeathed to you through a process in which you had no involvement in, but that's what you're kind of left with. And I would suggest that states are in different positions to push regimes of territorial legitimation, depending on how they can articulate with these foundational ideas. And the basic point I want to make today is that those RTLs that are grounded in some kind of historic ethno-cultural distinctiveness carry with it a certain kind of psychological and emotional power that makes it actually harder to resolve than the other ones. Now, don't look at this list too long, because this is not a definitive list. It's one I just sort of put together at one point. Here's some examples of cases where you can see constitutions that declare official languages and religions, talk about an ethnocultural base to a way that nation and territorial state is imagined. Boy, there it is in Spain, right? I don't want to leave this up too long, because there's all sorts of cases I can think of that belong on this list, and there are a couple of questionable ones. And then there are others maybe that are more ethno-religious in inspiration. You gotta say something about where we are here. But the point is that those RTLs that have some kind of foundation in ethnocultural terms carry with them a certain kind of psychological, emotional inertia that I think if you look around at many of the territorial conflicts around the world, the ones that have been resolved and the ones that haven't been resolved, it's the ones that haven't been resolved that overwhelmingly can fit within that category. And to make the case, I want to contrast two examples. Now, I was trying, comparative studies are extremely difficult. You can always argue that there are big contextual differences at play, but I think it's rich often to try to grapple with comparisons. And the comparison that I want to look at is actually between two territorial conflicts of longstanding Greece, Turkey, Ecuador, Peru, one of which, Ecuador, Peru, has actually been relatively settled since 1998, the other of which is still, just boiling below the surface. And academic talks are not mystery novels. So the point I want to make here is that this one has a much more deep-seated historic ethnocultural foundation than this one that inevitably is tied to historical, territorial boundary shifts. And yet, if you were to look at it, you'd say, over the last 90 years, there's been more violence associated with this one than with that one. And you might say, well, you sort of think maybe it's the Greece-Turkey one that might be settled and not the Ecuador-Peru one. So just to take us briefly through these two is a sort of interesting contrasting case to help sort of distill what I'm trying to get at here today. It's interesting in this dispute, both Greece and Turkey have these sort of ancient analogs back to sort of seeing themselves as carrying on the mantle of the Eastern Roman Empire, whether it's through Byzantium or the Ottoman era. But the real key, of course, is that these states came into being in the age of nationalism. And in the Greek case, it's a case, the earlier one of these, where the emergence of the Greek independent state in the 1820s was very much associated with the nation-state idea, a state for the Greeks. And where were the Greeks at the time? Well, in what we now think of as Greece, but also substantial numbers along not just the islands off the west coast of Turkey, but in Turkey itself. Like Smyrna was a huge population of Greeks in Smyrna. So this so-called Megali idea, which is represented on this map that appeared in the Athens newspaper in 1920, kind of give you some sense of the territorial dimension that goes along with that sort of ethnic idea. In the Turkish case, of course, Turkey emerges out of the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, faced with all sorts of nationalist insurrections in various places and a great deal of pressure from outside. Ataturk rises up and declares a state for the Turkish people. Well, where are the Turkish people? Well, they're, of course, in, the Anatolian heartland, but they're also on islands off the coast. They're also in parts of what we now think of as Eastern Greece. As I'm sure most people know, this disintegrates into a significant conflict at the beginning of the 1920s, enormous loss of life, and eventually kind of with a stalemate, nobody's going anywhere, there's a treaty signed, which actually, now we're sort of thinking, why might this one be settled? In the wake of this treaty, there were huge repatriations of Greeks to Greece, if you can use that term. There were Turks moving to Turkey. It actually, the patterns on the ground started to conform more neatly with the nation-state ideal. But the territorial imaginaries were still very much rooted in these prior dynamics that I've just tried to sketch very, very briefly. And those ended up, even though the treaty itself was accepted, and we can talk about exactly where along the river and so forth this went, but it almost got projected into the maritime arena, where there's been a lot of disputes, into a couple of islands, some disputes along the river in far north. It was a major focus of settlement, and then in a kind of proxy sense into Cyprus. And unless we think this is all behind us, the coming into power of Erdogan, the Erdogan regime with a very nationalist kind of agenda of a different sort, but very much rooted in kind of ethnocultural notions, maybe helped to give birth in some senses to this idea, the blue homeland idea, which has this very expansive view of what Turkey's maritime borders might be, and lest this be just seen as the kind of work of sort of crackpot institute or something like that. This is a news conference that Erdogan gave in 2019. Now, they backed away from this recently, but there's no question this is not a conflict that has settled. I mean, it's just sort of continues to simmer right along. Now, contrast that for a minute with the Ecuador-Peru dispute. Here's a dispute that is unquestionably still about nationalism, Ecuadorians, Peruvians. But this notion of Ecuadorians and Peruvians, it's hard to sort of cast it in the same light. I mean, they're both Catholic countries, they both have a mix of whites and mestizo and indigenous peoples. It's inevitably instead rooted in a kind of territorial history. When Spain comes in, they create one grand viceroyalty in the entire Spanish-controlled part of South America. It becomes too hard to administer, so it gets divided up. And then there's a Real Audiencia focused on Quito and another one focused on Lima. We have the birth of these ideas of what's going to become states here. And by the early 18th century, a good chunk of this then gets through boundary adjustments gets put into this viceroyalty of New Granada. Here's the area in dispute down here. But of course, this area in dispute is then going to go through this whole set of territorial adjustments, and I can guarantee I can put you to sleep if I haven't done so already in short order. And some of these accounts of these territorial disputes are excellent sleep aids. If any of you are struggling with jet lag as I have the last couple of days. But there was a period in the 1700s when this area was transferred to control. It was only a 16-year period, but it was transferred to control. There's very disputed in the beginning of the 1800s, controversial Spanish decree that the Peruvians say transferred control of this to Peru. So when independence comes initially, well, there's that chunk of Ecuador that was in dispute with Peru. It's part of Gran Colombia when Ecuador splits off 11 years later. There it still is. But it's kind of some old-fashioned geography that gets involved here. Here's a topographic map of Ecuador, and here's the Amazonian portion. Ecuador was not in a strong position, actually, to exert a lot of effective control over that area. Peru was in a better position to do so, and so Peru starts moving up, effectively becoming the dominant presence. Of course, Ecuador doesn't agree with this. Brent couldn't be to see the postage stamp, but I put it in his honor. Even the United States, I found this puzzle from 1941, which shows the Ecuadorian borders produced with that area in dispute that's part of Ecuador itself. Well, this is going to result in significant conflicts in 1941, the middle 1980s, and the 1990s. And there was a conflict in 1941 that ultimately established Peru's actually internationally recognized right to this area, pushed actually by the United States, who sort of changed positions given the facts on the ground, if you will, along with Brazil and Argentina and Chile. And this area is given to Peru. In exchange, Peru, because of this war that was fought, has to withdraw its forces. It has to guarantee certain navigation rights for Ecuador in the Amazon. But it's not long before the Ecuadorians are saying this was imposed on us under duress. They find new geographical information, which was the tributaries that extended into the Amazon. They say wasn't available at the time. They claim that their navigation rights are being violated. So there's a war that breaks out. Actually, initially in the 80s, and then in 1995, the Senapol War that may be within the memory of some of you here. And this one ends with actually Ecuador being able to stand up more to Peru, but it ends in a settlement that actually is holding to this day and has largely settled the conflict. So why were they willing to settle? Well, they're willing to settle for some functional reasons. Both Peru and Ecuador were in a kind of fragile economic and political shape. Peru was willing to make more guarantees of navigation rights and so forth. But I would suggest there's a backdrop to this that actually explains more why they were willing to settle, which is that there was not that kind of deep-seated emotional tie, the ethnocultural argument ties to territory that is present in the Greek and Turkish case. Now, I'm guessing I'm almost out of time, but I am almost out of words as well. So this Brasilia peace agreement that was entered into then in 1998, that's pretty much, you don't see much about this conflict despite its volatile nature. So what's the point? Well, the point is that it's the title of this book. It's not that I'm particularly recommending the book, but I think the title makes some sense. The psychology of nationalism carries with it enormous baggage. It creates a stickiness to territorial ideology and the regimes that go with it that I think cannot be underestimated, and that can go a long way towards helping us understand why some territorial disputes are more amenable to settlement than others. Unless we think that this whole sort of veneer of ethnocultural historical baggage is behind us. I mean, it was just a year ago
wave of on the eve of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when Putin made a speech to the Russian people. And what was emphasized in the speech? Well, this is all part of Kiev and Rus. These are all part of the same ethnocultural realm. And that whole notion has been driven through even in terms of the way that minorities are thought about in Ukraine, as we were hearing about in one of the papers this morning. So my point is that when we think there's this sort of critical border studies project, and I would suggest there's a real room in this critical border studies project to get us beyond just the institutional and to really sort of take more seriously this kind of perspectival and emotional characteristic of things. I used to say, I even gave a couple of talks at the Foreign Policy Institutes about, if that early argument about the importance of historical norms is right, when we look around and say, what are the boundaries that are most likely to be volatile? The best map is not the one of resource distributions, it's not the one of population distributions, it's of historical territories where you can see where they differ from what they are today. But my twist on it today is not just that tells us the ones that are most likely to be in dispute, but if we put on top of that the regimes of territorial legitimation that are pushed in various instances, we can also get a better sense of which ones are more amenable to settlement. So I don't have, and this is my last slide, this doesn't mean I have a solution of how to calm these conflicts, but I do think there are some conceptual and research implications for what I've talked about today, and there are these three. I think the importance of hardly something I actually need to say here because I've heard several papers here talk about exactly this, but the importance of focusing on tangible institutional factors alone can provide only limited insight. That territorial nationalism is not one thing. Historical, geographic context matters. Place matters. I was commissioned by Polity Press to write the little book, Geography, Why It Matters. And, there's always that, well, we need to understand spatial arrangements and distributions, but one of the fundamental messages was we actually also have to understand how where something happens affects what happens. And then finally, that boundary studies need to take seriously the nexus between the tangible material and an institutional perspective. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much for great presentation. Thank you. And now we have Professor Devine himself. One of the most conservative border scholars. And the floor is yours. And do you want some water, by the way?
Sorry?
Do you want some water?
Water? Yes, I'd love some. Thank you.
Okay. Can someone bring some water? Oh, I go and get it. You've got 20 minutes.
No, it's missing me up. So it's very
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. There's a saying in Hebrew which says Hasan la holech yachef, which means that the shoemaker doesn't have sandals or shoes. Anyway, about 3:30 this morning, I was up and looking at all of today's problems that we resolved for the conference, About 4:30, I said, oh, I better just look at my own presentation. And I realized I left it at home. And I didn't have it on my laptop, and I didn't have it on my USB, so I quickly made a new presentation, which isn't a very sophisticated one. It's probably more notes for my own presentation. But I hope it will help me get through this in 20 minutes. Of course, one of the privileges you have when you organise a conference like this, you can, to a large extent, although there is a scientific committee, you can largely define what are the topics you want to bring up and what you don't want to bring up. And I decided, having worked in this field for so long, and always now, a lot of my colleagues know, talking about the fact that I'm on my road to retirement, saying, and coming from political geography and borders, so let's have a sort of a final session which looks at the state of the art. From different perspectives. Alex is well known for his work on territory and political geography. I want to do it on what have we learned from Baldry studies in the last 30, 40 years, and we'll end up with the session where basically is asking the question, what's on the agenda now for tomorrow, for the next generation of scholars? And at the risk of repeating things that some of you have heard me say many times, I'm going to show a cartoon which so many of you have seen so many times in my lectures, but I promise you I decided this is the last time I'm ever going to use it. And I'm going to get to it in a minute, but of course there's also that famous joke which I always remind people, you know, the famous joke which I think actually at a conference we had in Israel about 25, 30 years ago, and then 2 nights ago, my good friend Chaim Hames, the provost or the rector, was here at the university. Then the rector came to, who was then an engineer, and he came to open or give greetings at the conference dinner. And he said to me, David, what is the conference about? And I told him about borders and geopolitics. And he came up with this, a joke which some of you know, you've heard it in different contexts, where he said, you know, my grandfather used to tell me that, who lived in Central Eastern Europe at the beginning of the 20th century, he said that when he was a kid, he lived in, well, you can always replace different names of countries for this. He lived in country A. All his youth and studies, he lived in country B. When he was a working man, he lived in country C. And when he retired, he was back in the first country he started in. And I said to him, grandfather, how is it possible that in a pre-mobile era, forget about planes, forget about cyberspace, forget about cars, you know, there were just about horse carts if you had a rough track. How were you so mobile in your life? And he said, what do you mean mobile? I never left the house I was born in. Just every 20 years there was a war, an agreement, they shifted the border around me, and I became a citizen of this country and that country, but I've never left the place I grew up in. I've always thought that that's the counter-border narrative, the one which says that, you know, we always think that our lives are impacted by borders, but to a certain extent, well, his citizenship was impacted, but his life was not impacted. Other people's lives were impacted as such, and we always have to look at borders from the two perspectives of not just the border and the territory as the output of the political process, but also as the dynamic which creates the next round of political resolution. Because I think as a geographer, as a former geographer, and there are many geographers in this room, we often have that problem of trying to sort of apologize for what we are, trying to explain what we are, because, you know, what's geography? It's the maps, it's the lines, it's the outcome, but no, state and territory, as Alex so eloquently just showed, you know, it's the dynamic input as well. It's part of the input in the process as well, not just the output. And when we look at borders, we have to think of what the impact the borders has on communities, local communities, on global communities, and so on. And as you know, the one caricature which you've seen 20 times in my lectures, I promise it's the last time, which I think summarizes all of border studies, is pretty much the simplest. My collection, by the way, has nearly reached 400 now. And I suppose I should really have made a poster collection for this conference. But I always come back to this one because I always think it's at one and the same time, the simplest and the most complex. It shows everything that you can put under the title of border studies. On the one hand, you see a small desert island with two women looking over the fence, the classic European notion that the first thing that you do when you lay claim to a piece of territory is you put up the fence or the wall between you, around the concept of good fences make good borders. And then you say, no, it can be exactly the opposite. These people have been living on both sides of the fence for I don't know how many years. And suddenly, for the first time, they decided to reach out beyond the fence and start talking to each other. And if I come back in 1 year's time, then maybe that fence would have been removed, maybe it had been opened. And then I say to students, write me an essay about this caricature. And there's always been some original ideas. There's always the idea that, well, you don't really see what's on the other side of the fence. For you know, it could be just a little jutting out of a peninsula of a huge continent. Maybe it's not an island in the sea. And of course, people point out the gender narrative, which is here. If you look at 40 years of border studies, certainly until a few years ago, it's very much political geography, geopolitics, but also it's very much the male domain of political science and international relations. That's not what we see there. And so from one end of the continuum to the other end of the continuum, that says you can really include so many different things within this general title of border studies. What in my own development over time, and Alex has been part of that, have we seen the post-World War II renaissance of these things? Well, you know, if you look at the 50s and 60s, then of course there wasn't much political geography or geopolitics around because of its German associations, its Haushofer associations in World War II. You didn't teach political geography, although political geography prior to World War II, politische Geography was one of the more developed disciplines of human geography. And then we had, from the 80s onwards, the renaissance of political geography. The journal started in 82. I think, did we first get together in San Sebastian in 86? And what I always call the Ratzel Rehabilitation Conference in I think it was 88.
1998.
1998, you're right. That's where we first met as well and had a famous road trip in Milan, if I remember. But where it was 100 years to Ratzel's famous politische Geography, and then suddenly people said, you know, he wrote more than just about the 7 laws of state, organism, and dynamics. He wrote a lot of other stuff as well. And I always think that these dates are very important in the way that political geography became rehabilitated. A few years later, even the nasty term, the black term, geopolitics, the journal which I edited for about 15 years, was originally called Geopolitics and International Boundaries because people were a bit afraid. And I'm talking about in Britain and in North America of calling something geopolitics. And Vladimir, who unfortunately could not be with us today, said that for many years afterwards, you still couldn't really talk about geopolitics in Russia and the Soviet Union. I should just say, by the way, last year, after about a year of negotiations, I was invited to go to what they call an NGINMO. It's a sort of a Russian university in Moscow where a lot of the foreign office people do MAs and PhDs, to be a 6-week fellow there and teach a course on European and Middle Eastern geopolitics. And it was all arranged, it was going to be very interesting. And then some people in the Russian Foreign Ministry or the Prime Minister decided rather than have some theoretician coming from Israel, they would put into effect again a new form of applied geopolitics, and they invaded Ukraine. So I never got around to doing that. But Vladimir told me that even to this day, but certainly not long later, the term geopolitics wasn't so accepted. It had become accepted. And then parallel to that, and over the last 3 or 4 years, looking around this hall, many of you have been part of it, we've had this amazing renaissance of border studies. And what I've always argued, both then and even looking around the people who have come to this conference, it is very much a metaphor for crossing borders, because we really have a cross-disciplinary border audience at this conference. We're not just geographers and we're not just political scientists. We have sociologists and anthropologists and all sorts of different social science sub-disciplines coming here, meeting across the border. As Eleanor rightly said, we often use the same terms but are not talking about the same thing when we meet in that frontier space, but nevertheless we're using a glossary of terms which we need to sort of work through together. What was the myth of the borderless world theory? And of course they came together because there was this borderless world theory going around at the end of the 80s and in the 90s. which was partly due to technology, globalization theory, and the cross-border dissemination of information and capital, and also because of historical and political contingency. The walls of the Iron Curtain had come down, the Berlin Wall had come down, and that was a symbol to many border scholars for 20, 30 years, until we started rebuilding walls, and now there are many more walls and fences of that nature in the world than there were at the time of the Berlin Wall. And because of the expansion, that happens at 4 o'clock in the morning, the expansion of the EU and the falling of the borders. So bring the technology and the political contingency together, and you had this development of the borderless world theory. And I think that's when a lot of us came together and said, borders are changing, but they're not disappearing. They may not necessarily be the physical lines, but there are so many other dimensions of borders, and that's when we became much more cross-border in the way that we dealt with borders. And you can see, you know, the classical border studies that have been, the few who dealt with the time, people like Hartshaw and Jones and the Mingy topology in the AAG of the 1960s, were pretty descriptive. They classified borders amongst different types, but didn't go beyond that. We've moved beyond the geographical and the territorial to looking at the vertical, the social, the cultural. The borders are constructions which we deal with. They can divide, they can separate, they can reflect difference, they can create difference, but we're always trying to manage them and cross them, whatever sort they are. And as I said already a minute ago, we've moved beyond borders as an outcome and focusing on the dynamics and functions of the process, and moving beyond many of the artificial academic borders and meeting in scientific frontier spaces. And any of you like myself who's been in academic administration knows that this notion of multidisciplinarity, crossing borders, is always a lovely concept until you really meet it in the committees. And people say, well, what is this person? Is he a sociologist or is he a geographer? Why is he publishing in so many different disciplines? And if they're not saying that, they're saying, why does this person only publish in one discipline and doesn't cross the borders? It's an argument you never win. But of course, they're very inflexible, some of these academic boundaries, and they're very difficult to cross. But nevertheless, it's a good metaphor for understanding what's going on here. Now, why isn't this moving on? Why isn't this moving? Okay, sorry. Okay, and then and so we look at a number of the themes. I can see that actually we don't have the whole of the slide there, but the themes in contemporary border studies, and they're really very diverse. The bordering process. The one that always fascinates me, I suppose, because I'm a political geographer, regardless of whatever disciplinary house I live in, and that is the nature of power relations, border management and power relations. We're all interested in the process of crossing borders, how we do it. Is it easy? Is it difficult? What do we need to cross borders? The difference beyond borders is encountering difference always something good, not necessary. We sometimes encounter the difference and don't like it and run back into our own self-imposed ghettos where we feel more comfortable. And in the last few years, I think we've gone from having a huge focus on the wall and the return of the wall. Look at the papers in this conference and look how many relate to borders in the post-COVID era. That's a big theme. I don't think it's going to be around that long, as a matter of fact, but nevertheless, it's a big theme right now, and it probably takes up 20 to 30% of the themes and the titles of the papers at this conference. A variety of geographical and social scales, from the notion of binaries, fixed lines, and something, of course, which interests a lot of us, images and representations. And she's one of the leading exponents in this area. I've managed to finally have one of my wishes granted again because I exercise the power of conference controller manager of having 5 consecutive film sessions. We could have a whole conference just about border films. Art, caricatures, my baby, poetry, literature, and you could go on and on. The way the borders are represented and the way we use borders to represent real-world politics, particularly, not exclusively, but particularly in countries where maybe political protest is not always easy to demonstrate publicly, and sometimes comedy, and particularly caricatures, is one way of doing that. So we've moved in the last few years, from looking at the walls, and a huge selection of my caricatures of Trump on walls, to looking at this sort of thing of the last few years, to looking, I had to get some caricatures in there somewhere, and to looking at the way that COVID, of course, pays no attention whatsoever to virtually everything that we've been discussing about borders over the past 10 years. There's been a return with a vengeance of walls and migration, as particularly the Western world has closed up again. It's used security threats, sometimes for real, but sometimes as a very convenient narrative to prevent other sorts of groups and other sorts of peoples crossing borders. And so therefore we always say, you know, walls have come back. This is the great European Union. People are begging to get in because they're coming from persecuted countries. And of course, this has become a very major thing which has to be of our concern, which we have to be aware and make our students socially aware of the way that walls and borders sometimes are important, but sometimes are used and exploited and manipulated in a narrative to prevent certain types of people and certain types of groups who require our assistance from crossing those borders and coming into our spaces. I think, and I've said this before, the big challenge today, as we've moved through 30, 40 years of different border studies, is to look at not at one narrative facing off the other narrative, the narrative, you know, that was 30 years ago, opening borders, moving towards borderless worlds, or the narrative of the past 10 years, we're reclosing borders, we're rebuilding walls. But the fact that in much of the Western world, we're dealing with both of these narratives in the same place at one and the same time. It is convenient for us, I say us, for politicians, for decision makers. It is convenient to have open borders for certain factors and to have closed borders for other factors. We live in an open economic world that's never going to close again, but we want to do that with closed borders for migrants and so on. And how do you play off one and the other at one and the same time? I think that's one of the big mega questions facing the border scholars of the next few years. Just a quick word on the institutionalization of border studies, as it's grown so immensely in the last few years. I would say there are at least 4 major journals which deal with border studies. Journal of Borderland Studies, which used to deal exclusively with Mexico, USA, has become an excellent outlet for international border studies, increasingly for conceptual stuff. The editor, Christoph Son, is here, and in our half-hour closing session, immediately after this session, he'll say a few words about the possibility of submitting papers to that. Political geography, geopolitics, which I edited, has an enormous amount of border submissions, and the excellent review journal, which Emmanuel and his team now edit, which is which has very interesting new facets and new directions and new ideas about borders. And that's also something which I highly recommend. I can't tell you whether your university administrators will yet to say it's a top-cited journal, but it's going that way, and it will get there because it has some really interesting, innovative stuff coming out there. And look at all of these stuff that has come out. Gideon Biga sitting here, he edited, I would say, in a positive way, a very traditional encyclopedia of international boundaries, Emmanuel Border Disputes, and Birta Wassenberg is here with her European encyclopedia of boundaries. So we're looking at borders from many different regional aspects, maybe not enough yet in Africa and Asia, but it's certainly growing up there, as again we can see from the fantastic presence here of scholars from Asia, from India, from African countries, which is also important for the expansion of the understanding of border studies. I just mentioned a few people. I didn't know whether to stick this in this morning because I know there's so many people not on this list who should be on this list, and some of them are sitting in this room. But just to give you an idea, we're witnessing a transition from some of the classical border scholars, Moshe Brava, from Israel, who passed away just 2 years ago at the amazing age of 101, and just a few weeks previously was still creating atlases and giving talks. An amazing personality. Marty Glasner, Julia Mingy, my own PhD advisor. We then set up Ibru, and I met just recently, I tried to get into this conference, but he's not traveling anymore, Gerald Blake and David Knight. These were people, they're not just part of the classic school, but they helped move the transition into the Renaissance of political geography. And there's a whole group of people there, Ansi, Henku, Auntie, Emmanuel, Anne, Elizabeth, James, and others who are so much a part of the important development of border studies today and who are bringing forward students who need to ask the next generation of questions. So I think that's where we've come in 40 years. I think it's been very healthy. It's been crossing disciplinary boundaries. It's raised a lot of issues which are relevant to real world issues. Migration, building walls, including and excluding, and what we need to ask from the next generation of scholars, which I hope we will get in the third presentation in this session, is what are the main topics and questions on the agenda for the next generation of border scholars? Thank you.
Okay, I dare say you managed notwithstanding the loss of your PowerPoint, and the next speaker are Anne Thévenet from the Euro Institute, KELT, and Emmanuel Brunet-Jailly, and they are going to speak about the 21st Century Borders Project and the future agenda of border studies. So we are eager to listen to them.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me here, for inviting me. Thank you, David and the Association for Borderland Studies. Thank you also, Emmanuel, for the presentation we actually prepared together, but that I will be presenting now on the 21st Century Borders Project and the future agenda of border studies. What about partnering within this 21st Century Border Project? And I'm very also happy to be here because you will just see it. Maybe it's not so usual for you, but I'm not a scholar, I'm a practitioner. So speaking about the future agenda, it might be quite funny to you, but it was really interesting for me to work on this presentation and to ask myself what would be interesting also for me and for the network. I will also just say 2 words about it. But I'm coming from the Franco-German border, working at the Euro Institute, which is an institute that facilitates cross-border cooperation through training, studies, accompanying measures. And our idea was from the beginning on to have this exchange between practitioners and scholars, because we thought only that way we could do great work for the cross-border cooperation. And that's why also we had so many contexts within Europe with other borders, universities, cross-border actors, and we decided to create the Transfrontier Euro Institute network. I didn't choose the name, it was my partner, so there is the word Euro Institute in there, but yeah, and we became then, because of the invitation of Emmanuel, and I thank him for that, part of this big adventure, which is the 21st Century Borders Project. Just for you to know, TAME, it is a network. You see on the map the different borders that are represented in the network. 11 at the moment, with 17 partners and 2 associated members. And the idea is really to gather ideas to facilitate cross-border cooperation, provide practical solutions to actors, strengthen capacity of actors, but also do some research in order to raise awareness about the importance of cross-border cooperation border studies. And this way, because we are located in Europe, also strengthen European integration. And now that you know where I'm speaking from, so to say, I will just say a few words also on the story of BIG, because BIG began before the 21st Century Border Project. It was the first Border in Globalization project, and you see here that this BIG project has done a lot of work, as it was already mentioned by David mentioning the journal, but the big was about 15 books, 109 publications, 8 special issues of academic journal, 43 single articles. So you see, it was huge work that has been done between 2012 and 2019. It was an amazing team, and you see here again some numbers that shows that near the publications, Big had also many students involved, 180 students funded, more than 300 students engaged. Big, it was also many events where scholars could meet and exchange. It was 40 events, including 11 summer school, 3 international conference, and also participants in online border courses. There were 600 of them. So huge work that has been done, and after the project, it was not possible to just stop there. So Emmanuel did a great work in order to pursue the work, with the 21st Century Border Project. And who is behind this project? Of course, it's Emmanuel, but not only. There are so many partners in this partnership. And I will not cite all of the partners, but you have to know that it's, of course, scholars, but also 15 non-university partners from very different backgrounds, 4 large intergovernmental and transnational policy organization, the World Custom Organization, and the IBR, for example, that were represented during this conference. 3 local and regionals, 10, of course, but also, for example, the Center for Transboundary Cooperation. 3 indigenous-led organizations, the Community Toolset, for example, media outlets, and of course also 24 co-applicants from 16 universities in the world, 9 countries, 33 collaborators, and 13 formal university partners. You see, it's a huge partnership, and who has already coordinated project can imagine the huge work for coordinating such a project. But also there, we have a very clear line, so to say, within the big project, and after having done all those partners agreements in order to focus our work, the idea is that we have meetings together, that we can identify some projects together, produce your research, of course. Then there is, of course, peer-reviewed research revision, and finally, the dissemination also of the research. The 4 years between 2022 last year and 2026 will focus really on the research production, and then last year will be much more about dissemination and reporting. So now we will, you will wonder what we are doing within this 21st Century Border Project, what it is about in our project. And you will see that the research program is divided between 2 main pillars. In pillar 1, the focus is much more on governance questions related to border and nationhood, indigenous resurgence, self-determination, new nationalism, culture, and history. This is also more territory-based pillar. And then we have pillar 2 that invite us to think out of the territory, think about out of the box, and focuses on governance questions related to borders and connectivity flows, migration and regulation. Think about the border not being only at the geographical border, but maybe also in airports or seaports, etc. So, of course, we have some topics that are crossing the 2 pillars, like environment, for example, or security issues. But the idea is to focus on those 2 main thematic that guide the strategy and the research for the next years. And now I will tell you a little bit more how we could contribute to this. Of course, this is my perspective, maybe as also a practitioner, and also a more European perspective, as we are a European network. But let me just tell you where did I start? Because of course, as a practitioner since almost 20 years, my first experience working with scholars was with Goethe and also with Joachim Beck, and we decided to work on a series of conference and publication about living and researching cross-border cooperation. And I can really remember the first meeting we had in this in this project. And for me as a practitioner, it was like, okay, I finally have the solution. I have some problems in my daily practice, and then I will have some scholars who will have a look at my problems and who will help me finding solutions, capitalizing on experience and finding methods in order to do my job better. And then I was like, in the meeting, very astonished, because we had this presentation and every scholar said, yeah, I'm working on this and this, and I could do a paper on this and this. And for me, there were no link between everything. And I said, okay, but do I have really some tools and methods in the end? Actually, not really. And I was also astonished because at that time, it is now also a long time ago, but there was this idea of having many disciplines in the room, but not thinking transdisciplinary. Interdisciplinary at the end of the project might be, but not transdisciplinary. And so this is why also the second step for us was to think about the second publication that you see just beyond, about the transdisciplinary discourse on cross-border cooperation, to see how the different disciplines could help a cross-border cooperation, which methods, which analysis, which tools, which concepts they could develop in order to improve cross-border cooperation. And so, yes, this is where we come from. And now I think we very much talked also about states and capitals and nations, but for me, it's also the time to think from the border, maybe, into the research and identify where the border is, or even think beyond the border in order to really improve things. And of course, and this is this conference is a huge example for this, the exchange between borders, between continents, even if there are so many different realities, and we really saw that during those 4 days are very different. This is amazing, and this is really great to have this exchange. It is food for thought, and it can really help doing things better. And for now, what is needed from my perspective, it's a need for precise and detailed analysis of situation. Also a need for capitalization and conceptualization. A need for creating tools and methods, and also need for maybe thinking in terms of database or archiving. Along these needs, I will try to show the complementarity within the big 21st Century project and the TAIN network. So the TAIN contribution to the 21st Century project has started with 2 conferences that took place 2021 on border security and nationhood, and the last one co-organized also with Market, who is in the room, on border influx and border temporalities in and beyond Europe in last December. The next one, you are all invited if you wish. It will be on contesting 21st century borders, and will take place at Frankfurt Oder, at the Franco-Polish border. And more generally, what it is about for TAIN, it's to be the guarant also in this project of the exchange between research and practice, to give access to the field, to do some cooperation and data collection. We know that it's a huge thing, and make scholar practitioners, civil servants, politicians aware of our common work, because it's all about dissemination. You can work a lot, but if it's not known, if nobody knows about it, then it's a pity, and so we'll have to work on this dissemination. And of course, we share this common interest on improving cross-border policy making. And so I started a little survey in our network in order to see what were the potentials for a common area and for the future agenda of border studies. And you already saw the dictionary. Just to mention that it's an open source now, so we can have access for free on the internet. But this was already done, but what we would need maybe now is an evaluation of the cross-border cooperation, taking into account all its different aspects, social, economic, functional, political, cognitive, integration, etc., over a long period of time. Because now we have maybe we can do this step back, at least in Europe, in order to really go deeper in this. Then, of course, it could be the analysis of diversity of circumstances, speed and models of development of cross-border cooperation based on different situations, nationalism, identity, memories, history, flows, territoriality, and so on. Of course, we are facing cross-border obstacles. We have some tools in order to work on them, but analyzing them in all their dimensions could be worth it, because we are somehow in Europe very much talking about legal and administrative obstacles, but they have so many other dimensions: legal, economic, political, technical, intercultural, interpersonal. So analyze them in all those dimensions could be good. And then this is also the idea of looking at law and how it is applied in a border area, a border region. How could we synergize the different laws on the regional, national, the European level in cross-border territory? Then going a step further, we very much like the concept also of horizontal integration. There were already something published on this by Joachim Beck, who was thinking about it at the very first, but this is the idea of going beyond this, to analyze this, to test this also. The horizontal integration, it's, well, on the contrary, it's opposed to the vertical integration that goes in Europe from the EU to the nation states, to the regional and local level, but to just think integration in a much more horizontal perspective across the border between regional or local administration, and to see how it could work, how it could help. Then we could also focus on very concrete aspects. For example, how to develop efficient, well-balanced and functioning cross-border labor markets. I know this is much more a European reality, maybe, but we are facing really some issues on tax issues, social and legal issues, but also intercultural one. And of course, with the remote work now, there are some more questions that's raised. It's also about thinking of building cross-border public services. We have some, but it is not a smooth cooperation. We have to think about how to do it better with the different aspects in that. I already mentioned it, the elaboration of common data, of course. Also, for example, the idea of creating economic zone. This is much more related to the practice, but their concepts, methods could really help. And then, of course, if we think about third party, I would say, but citizens' engagement is really important in cross-border cooperation. And so we'll could also think about working more on which role, how, the added value, the methods that we could use for this. There were many talks during this conference about migration issue, but which impact does it has on the border regions? And of course, living in a more and more virtual context, and how technology could or is likely to influence the thinking on experiencing of borders. And the last idea, which is, I think, a very important one, is, and that you might all face, is I think there is no place at the moment in order to find all the literature, all the information you would need on what has been published on cross-border issue. We started, I think, 10 years ago thinking about this within the team without finding any solution. But now we are very happy that we have a new member with Martel who is thinking about this also. And we will try to really go for this and really have this cooperation, because we think it's needed between the historians, because they are much more also going back in history and maybe using the archive in archivists, of course, but also a cross-border practitioner that could help. And of course, if we are doing this, we should not forget to defining standards and offer the training for archivists, but also for the users of such a database or archive. So I come now to my conclusion, and yes, of course, this was only a very small perspective, and I think I've been, of course, not in all panels, but the panels I attended to, there are plenty of ideas, plenty of things we could go deeper on, and really thank you for this conference, which is really food for thought. And I think after having attended such a conference, each of us will gain energy and inspiration to go on. I would say, well, for me, this idea of doing transdisciplinary work is also very important, disciplinary also, but thinking out of the box and thinking together is important. And this is also the platform and the framework that the 21st Century Borders Project offers. For me, of course, as a practitioner, it was very important to say, well, this is also about citizens and facilitates life from the citizens who deserve a sort of normal life, even when living at the border. And also mentioning the fact that, of course, we speak about border, but we speak also about cooperation. And cooperation, it's not only a field of research, it's a way of working. And yeah, we hope to contribute thereby really efficiently to the future agenda of border studies. And I would be happy to do it together with you. And thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much. And I think we have 10 minutes if we want to make some comments about the past or the future of border studies. I'd like to add a small line. We have been speaking in these days about many different things, about border representations, borderscapes, even the spirit of borders, and I thank the organizer of the session about the spirit of border. I think that we should maybe try to start thinking in the future of border studies about the emotions surrounding borders, and maybe use some theoretical perspective